Hello and welcome to the 1916 Company Podcast. I am Tim Masso, coming to you with Armand Johnston from our sales department. As ever, this is your show, so forward your questions for future episodes to podcasts at the1916company.com. Today's question, which is going to be the basis for the show, comes from Vez in Vienna, Austria. He wants to know horologically interesting watches for under $10,000. Now, there's a lot that you can get pre-owned and new for under 10 grand. I think you can be surprised at how much 5 digits buys you, even in 2024. So, Armand, do you have anything in mind that's going to surprise us right off the bat for 10 grand?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, speaking directly to the secondary market aspect of this, because this is a two-sided coin. There's secondary and primary, of course. So, I was just kind of scrolling through our website, in fact, and I filtered by pricing, and I found a fantastic Frank Mueller perpetual calendar listed at $99.50. Now, this is going to be probably an early 2000s, mid 2000s example of a Frank Mueller in a relatively round case, but you get a perpetual calendar, and granted, this is stainless steel, 39 millimeters, almost officer style lugs.
And it's round. That's the important thing to mention.
Yes, it is round. It's outrageous. It's really truthful bang for your buck.
Okay, now that's a nice piece, and I think it's great to have a Frank Mueller that's actually complicated, because the awkward question that follows almost every discussion of a Frank Mueller watch is, why does it say master of complication as if it just has 3 hands and a date?
I often talk about Frank Mueller and in the sense of complications, and there are quite a few time only and or time date Frank Muellers. And for every one that you have, you'll get a master banker, triple time zone, you'll get a jump hour, something like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting brand that kind of peaked in the 90s, and although it was arguably the first really successful independent, it lost momentum as independents became popular in the 2000s. It's weird. It's almost like it lives in a bizarro world where independents are not cool, but it is. And that era is the 90s. And then the world inverted in the 2000s. And I don't know what it was. Maybe it was Frank leaving the company in the early 2000s, or the fact that his business partner, Vartan Sermakis, who was not really a watch guy, but a business guy, took over the direction of the company. But I've never seen a successful brand lose so much wind from its sails so quickly. And those complicated watches, especially from the tail end of Frank's involvement in the early 2000s, those are the ones to buy.
There are a lot of huge complications that you can get at reasonable price points too. A Frank Mueller tourbillon from the era is not something that's going to break the bank.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. A Long Island tourbillon. The Long Island tourbillon, I want to say, came out around 2001, and you're getting a tourbillon that is a flying tourbillon, often diamond set, sometimes loomed. You're getting an extended power reserve. You're getting a movement that was one of the last actually worked on by Frank Mueller. That was the FM 2001 manual wind flying tourbillon. The Long Island's a fun piece, and it's sort of what you imagine when you imagine a Frank. It's not the curve excentré, it's not the tonneau, but it's sort of a long cushion case, and it harks back to the flappers and the Jazz Age and the Gatsby era North Shore of Long Island, when that sort of aesthetic, pre-Art Deco, late Art Nouveau, was really en vogue. It's a great piece with a lot of atmosphere and genuine horological interest. And again, we're talking about a tourbillon, not one you could buy for $10,000, mind you, but we're sort of on a tangent here. Okay, so let's talk about something I sort of owned but sort of didn't. Back in 1997, Zinn, which was then as now a hardcore tool watch brand, actually created a contract watch for the German Customs Service Enforcement Unit. So this ZUZ was involved in anti-trafficking, narcotics, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, a very serious business. So this was an armed group. This was basically a federal SWAT team. And the EZM-1 was created for them. It was a very utilitarian piece. 40 millimeters, titanium, 300 meters, water resistant. It had a reverse timing 60 to 0 countdown bezel. It became the first Einsatzzeitmesser from Zinn, the first mission timer. And it included an absolutely bomb-proof Lamagna 5100, which has the desirable quality of being basically unbreakable, but also having a central register 60-minute hand. So it becomes very easy to read both seconds and minutes on this watch. It's likely no more than 5 or 6 dozen were originally created for the ZUZ, and the watch went out of regular production in 2004 for civilian markets. There was, I think, around 2008, a resurrection for the Japanese marketplace because they knew what they were talking about. They wanted this watch even then. There is a 43mm 1.1, which I owned for 4 years, but the original 40mm titanium Easy M1 is a watch you can still buy. And I find them sometimes on the full factory titanium bracelet for under $7,000. If you want one on a strap, again, it's probably going to be beat up given the usage history. But if it is beat up from customs unit use, that almost makes it more desirable.
That's a story. That's an amazing story to attach to a watch like that.
And, people ask, why is the crown on the 9 o'clock side? And if you think about it, if you're right-handed and you're holding a rifle with a flashlight on the bayonet attachment, just think about how you're going to cradle that in your left hand. You're going to cradle the stock of it, or, you're going to basically turn your hand so it's prone, and the crown, if it were at 3 o'clock, would be digging into your wrist. So this was designed with the intention that the crown would point down the long part of your arm so it didn't dig into your wrist when you were advancing with a rifle and a flashlight.
Now, is that Destro in a nutshell, would you say?
Yeah, I would say so. I think there's...
Thank you.
Because this isn't just like, well, you might wear it on the other hand.
Thank you.
This is for a person who is right-handed. I mean, this is not for like the opposite-handed.
That is the line that I've been following actually since I got my left-handed GMT, and I feel it fundamentally that this is more comfortable with a left-handed crown. It's so funny thinking, the Destro is for lefties or anything like that when it is just, in fact, more comfortable for righties.
Yeah, it's really hard to find a watch that is truly not ambidextrous. It's difficult. I mean, you got to really hunt around, and then it might be some ridiculous thing like a Graham Chrono Fighter, which, by the way, you can get for under $10,000. So moving on to like other 10 grand watches, back in 2021, do you remember the Breitling Pistachio, the Premier B09 Pistachio, Armand?
I was just watching an old version of one of your shows, actually, and I was drooling over the Pistachio.
Do you remember how for the first, 6 months, they convinced themselves that this would be a permanently allotted watch? Like you'd have an allocation like with certain famous brands at the dealer level, and the dealer would know how many it would get, and that would be it.
And this is a watch that they possibly could have done it with if it appealed to a little bit more people. Again, it's one of my favorite in the Premier line. I think it is my favorite in the Premier line, but I do think the color doesn't appeal to everyone.
Well, there was like that period when it was allotted. I remember I went to a store and they said, "Look, we know we're only getting 5 of these. 4 are sold. Do you want it?" And I thought, yeah, whatever. Okay, sure. But then I went to another store and they told me the same thing, that they were being allotted. Now, granted, right now you can go out, you can buy these, and you can get them for like $6,500. So however long that lasted, it didn't last long enough. There have been these periods when certain brands are able to play, the allotment game. And, there was this period in like 2013, 2014, when Omega had a waiting list for the black side or the dark side of the moon and then the gray side of the moon. There was this period in 2021 when Breitling had allocations going out for the Pistachio and really could constrain supply and get people to wait. So yeah, you can buy those right now. Beautiful watches, 40mm steel case. They were smart to go with a no-date dial. Manual wind was interesting because it made the watch thinner, but also more of a purist's piece.
And that's based off of their B01, correct?
It is. It's a manual wind, 2 registered, no-date B01.
And the B01 was created by the team that created the 4130.
Some of them, yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting comparison, though. It's spread 9 years apart, so some of those folks were scattered to the wind. The main thing about the B01 was that it was not initially intended for display case backs. I guess you could say the 4130 wasn't either. But it wound up being a really good match for display case backs. Now, it launched in 2009 on the Chronomats, and again, those were not display caseback watches. It's only since 2017, with Georges Kern running the company, that we've started to see the B01. And fortunately, it's a decent looking movement with a decent size to fill a big watch.
It is a decent looking movement. The construction's actually pretty interesting. There's a lot to look at when you do look down the barrel at it.
Yeah, one of the problems with vertical clutch automatic chronos is that a lot of the fun stuff gets buried under a winding bridge. That's less of a problem with the B01 and even less of a problem with the B09 because there is no winding rotor. Okay, sub $10,000 watches. Here's one that really puzzles me. Why don't you go first? Because I'm saving this one up.
I love the watch you're about to talk about.
Oh, okay, we'll go with it. Okay, so I would have thought that about 8-9 years ago, people would have finally bid the Zenith Rainbow flyback into the stratosphere. After the Acorelli Tipo CP2 Chronometro came out, that watch went nuts and went from being the best kept secret in like issued watches to yet another expensive thing we can't buy. And yet, despite several attempts to pay tribute to the historic Rainbow flyback chrono, Zenith has not succeeded in pricing the enthusiast-level buyer out of the vintage market. You can go back and get the 02, 0480, 405 reference. You can get that watch for under $5,000 on a strap, under $6,000 on a bracelet, full box papers, bezel, dial intact, original tritium, and there's plenty of them. This watch, like the Zenith 1, was built to a military contract. French military aviation in the 90s, 1996. This thing was built for military flyers. It is incredibly rare. You know, we see it rarely with like the Rainbow Flyback, the EZM1, the Tudor Pelagos FXD, where a modern military unit actually contracts for a mechanical watch. These are rare and special, and this one even more so because not only was it an El Primero with a flyback, but it was a genuinely distinctive looking watch, and at 40 millimeters, it was a good size for the 90s.
I think you nailed it with the genuine, distinct-looking timepiece in general. You know, the bracelet is interesting, the bezel is interesting, the dial layout is interesting. And when I say interesting, I don't necessarily mean attractive to all parties. Again, this is actually maybe my favorite Zenith, actually, this piece in particular. But I do think that the bracelet's quirky. I do think that a little bit of everything going on is a little bit on the quirky side. And I think that probably plays a role against it. You know, you have this kind of Seamaster Audemars, Royal Oak style bracelet attached to a round watch with somewhat chunky lugs that I think fit and work really well. You have really interesting bezel to dial proportions that just fit. You have a rotating bezel. The watch really works. And it does make a very brief appearance in Sopranos, actually. Furio wears one.
Oh, wow. Had no idea. I will say this. The watch looks great on a strap. I agree with you that the bracelet is the one part of the watch that looks dated. Something about the use of like narrow intermediate links looks a little bit dressy. And that was not uncommon on watches of the 1990s. We saw it on Tag Heuers all the time. We saw it especially on the Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter, which came out with a bracelet that had little polished intermediates and primary links and secondary links and tertiary links. The links were rounded off on their sides, giving it a bit of a dress watch look. There's something about sports watch bracelets in the 90s, other than like the classic Oyster. Most of these bracelets just looked almost like they were splitting the difference between dinner and a rodeo, and it was a very jarring look. From our perspective in the 21st century, these bracelets look almost quaint, which is why I say buy the Zenith Rainbow with the caliber 405. There is a difference, and I'll explain that in a minute. Buy it, put the bracelet in the box, and just wear it on a leather strap with a red contrasting stitch, and it will look badass.
Yeah, it'll look sporty, it'll look racy, it'll look very, very cool. I like the red stitching idea. It'll match the bezel a little bit. That's super cool.
Now, a couple things to note. People think that the Rainbow is so named because it's rainbow colored. That's only true of one version of the flyback model. There is also a version that looks exactly like it with the caliber 405 that is very straight black and white. There's no color on the dial, there's no color on the bezel. There's also a rainbow series that's inspired by the yacht rainbow. So the J-Class America's Cup yacht of the 1930s, that rainbow inspires the other ones. And you'll note that those are not flybacks. They do not have timing bezels. And in general, they will have a picture of the yacht on the back. So if you're shopping rainbows, know what to look for. The reference I would search specifically is 020480.405. Remember that last part, 405, in a Zenith reference, that's the caliber, and you want to get the flyback. Also, look for one that doesn't have a bezel that's A, missing the luminescent pip, and B, so faded that it's lost its color. Unless the watch is absolutely perfect and like new in box from the 90s, try to find one that still has these qualities intact and hasn't been polished too much. All right, Armand, what you got for me?
So my next one is not a watch, but it is fun, and I do like it a lot. We have a really cool Naviquartz Mark III. It's a Patek Philippe quartz navigation clock. It is very, very cool. And this is what, Tim, from the 70s?
Yeah, late 1970s. These were made basically as they were suitable to use as navigation clocks. There's no doubt about that. They were what the label said. For the most part, they were bought by people who wanted the ultimate desktop trophy, which is why ours, like most of these, has a dedication plaque addressed to the first owner.
Dr. Arthur R. Siegel. He's a prolific gentleman, I hear.
It is a loud thing. I have shot a video of this, so if you're interested in learning more, check out Watchbox Reviews, now 1916 Reviews, and you will find all of the packaging that comes with it, because not only is its storage case, it's varnished and hardware-equipped storage case intact, the entire packaging for this thing, the original box for the box, is still intact and with it. And you will be hard-pressed to find another full-set 70s Patek Philippe desk chronometer.
And you're right. You know, this is... I'm a big tchotchke guy, and this is the ultimate tchotchke. It really, really is. It's awesome on any desk, on any shelf. And you're right. You put this on your fascination shelf, and you'll hear it across the room. You'll hear it in the next room potentially. It is a very loud timepiece.
Yes, and if you are going to use a marine chronometer, first get it calibrated. But you start moving a few seconds off true time, and you start wandering quite a few kilometers in terms of actual distance relative to where you think you're supposed to be. So these things were mostly made for ornamental and egotistical purposes, but they were also built with the understanding that it still had to function as a navigation instrument. They are rare and exquisite timekeepers, and purely as timekeepers, they are still hugely desirable.
What is next on your list?
You know, I've always said that if you want to get into high horology, Jaeger-LeCoultre is a great place to do it. And I've actually got two different suggestions. One is the Master Compressor Memovox, because the Master Compressor Memovox is everything JLC does in a package that was rightly described as the successor to the original Polaris. So now here's the thing. The tribute to Polaris came out in 2008. I believe it was 2008. And it was a line-for-line, millimeter-for-millimeter recreation of the Polaris 68. That's fine, but I don't like tribute watches and referential watches that trade on the fame and desirability of a different watch. It's almost like you're buying the watch that looks like the watch you'd really rather have. Whereas with the Master Compressor Memovox that came out in 2002, this was the next generation JLC diving alarm. And so now you go out, you buy these things for well under $6,000, and what do you get? You get 100-meter water resistance. You get a watch that's original and has a soul and has an animus that's all of its own that doesn't trade on any reflected glory. It's got the unique compressor crowns, which I think are probably going to be the next thing to be reissued by JLC. I think it's been over 2 decades now. Don't be shocked if we see a reissue of the compressor crowns. And this watch, more than any, epitomized what was great about that series. It's got an alarm. It's got an internal rotating dive bezel, again, like the Polaris, but not in the style of the Polaris. It's a Master 1000 hours control, and at 41 millimeters in steel, it's an easily wearable size. Once again, The price of these, don't worry about the platinum, don't worry about the gold, they're out there. Just go out and get one on a strap, get it for $6,000, box and papers, never polished, and now you've got a partially handmade, hand-finished watch from one of the greatest brands in the business. You've got something you can use everywhere. For travelers, you've got an alarm. For divers, you've got a bezel. For everything else, you've got an automatic winding 41mm steel watch with a great deal of lume, and it does have a nod and a wink to the old Polaris in the form of the hands and the indices and the numerals, but that's it. It doesn't look like the Polaris. It's almost like, you can have the modern Ford Mustang, which gives a nod to the 64.5 original with its fastback profile and its proportions, but it doesn't literally look like it rolled out of the 1960s. And that's what I love about the Master Compressor Memvox. And yes, the alarm is loud enough to wake you up, which I think is mandatory if you're buying an alarm watch. All right, you mentioned the Bel Canto, the Christopher Ward Bel Canto.
I did.
Let's talk about the Bel Canto. What do you think about it?
So the Bel Canto has come into my periphery through a collector group of friends of mine, and yours, of course, and they have been making their rounds. It's a very interesting piece. I'll go to start and say I do like it. I think it's fun. I think it. For those who don't know, the Bel Canto chimes on the hour. It is. It's a effectively time-only chiming watch that does chime once per hour. You can silence it. But the cool thing about it is that all of the, most of the business end is in the front. The chiming mechanism, you can see front and center kind of in that 6 o'clock portion of the dial. You have your timekeeping in a smaller clock dial at the 12 o'clock position. And it's a lot of fun. I think it punches a little bit above its weight orologically. I think to your point, it does kind of reach into the aesthetics of something that it's not necessarily, but I think for what it's not, it makes up for in complication.
And by that, I've always thought that, first of all, fair pricing. You can get one of these for under $4,000 new, so no harm, no foul. I don't think you lease nerdens going to worry at all that this thing looks like a tribute to the freewheel. And because this is Christopher Ward, there are many different dial colors. And because this is Christopher Ward, I know that group custom buys are possible. So you might be able to get something that is even more unique than, for example, a purple or a champagne or a light blue dial, all of which they offer. It's titanium and 41mm, so the material's right, the size is right. It is powered by basic Sellita SW200. So I would say having a sub $4,000 hour striker, sub 4 assuming you buy it on a strap, that seems like a pretty good deal. I do wonder how long the magic will last, whether people will ultimately tire of these and, unload them for like $2,500 on the aftermarket. But I think that it's fun enough that people will remain enchanted by this, whereas some of the other Christopher Wards that trade a little bit on the popularity of similar models, I'm thinking of the 12 here specifically. I don't know if those are going to have the longevity. I feel better about the Bel Canto because the first time I saw one of these, it was about 2 years ago in Singapore, and people seem to be as excited about it now as they were back then. And considering the hardware in that room that day, it was pretty impressive that somebody's $4,000 watch was drawing a crowd.
So that is what I think will fade as time goes on. I think people are going to like this watch for a while. I think they have to be very careful as to how many versions of it they do make. And, the group custom orders thing is interesting. I recently saw one that was a group custom order that was fantastic. I do think that's something that Christopher Ward should probably limit significantly as time goes on, just due to the fact that they do make quite a few Bel Cantos, as but I do think that if SKUs and if production are somewhat limited, I do think it's going to be fun for quite some time for somebody. And again, it represents something that a bang for your buck in a chiming watch is not a sentence that's said very often.
No, it's definitely, I think the only thing that would really compare would be some of the Kellogg-powered 5-minute repeaters from the 90s. Those were cool.
If I could be so bold as to give you one more to add to this list,
Sure.
It's also something that kind of is a fun repeater, and it's the Breitling Aerospace Evo.
Yeah.
That is probably It is probably the most complicated sub $10,000 watch that you can get, and the complications are all useful. They're all relatively available with the crank of a crown, and it works. I miss mine.
Well, the Aerospace is probably the best real tool watch you can buy. Let's put away nostalgic notions of what was considered a tool in 1952. So let's talk about what you would actually use if you were relying on an alarm as life-saving equipment. You would want it to be loud. You would want to have the option to set it to a time or a countdown, which is not the same thing. A countdown timer and a time of day alarm are two very different types of alarms. You'd probably want it to be visible and not in the faint and instantly diminishing sense of luminova, active backlighting, which the Aerospace has. You would want a multifunction watch that could get the maximum of mileage out of a single screen. So perpetual calendar, chronograph, second time zone, both analog and digital, the backlight system, running seconds, an alarm, a countdown timer, water resistance of 100 meters, a unidirectional rotating dive bezel, and a material that made it light enough so it wouldn't be an encumbrance or a liability on your wrist, so they'd make it out of titanium. All of these things the Aerospace is.
The one thing that it is not, however, is swimmable. And
Really?
which I think,
Despite the 100-meter rating.
I think that depends on the era actually for it.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Aerospace Evo.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the early versions of these were slightly lesser water resistant, and I had an early version, so that's what I go by.
Oh, okay.
And I think what that does is really segments the type of tool watch that it is in not a bad way. You know, not every tool watch needs to be water resistant, and I think this watch really kind of represents that. Now, you're right about the Evo, actually. It does have a little bit of extra water resistance. But I think it kind of segments what type of tool watch this is, and it's an instrument tool watch versus a go anywhere, do anything.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between a tool watch and a beater.
Fair.
I think that's the distinction we're making right here. Yeah, I think that Zin Easy M1 that opened the show, that is the definition of a beater tool watch.
Yep.
So I would also say, we talked about the Kellic minute repeaters. They're out there. They're not common, but, I found one on Chrono in gold, for $7,500. So these are out there. They're typically powered by some sort of ETA base. They've got the Kellic 5-minute repeater, and I believe Kellic was later purchased by Breitling, which internalized its module and complication making capability. But I also believe that several Chrono Swiss 5-minute repeaters were built on this Kellic module, and those Chrono Swiss repeaters are a little bit easier to find, and they've been made right up until the present day. So they're fairly easy to find, and critically, they can be serviced because the company is still around. So take a look. If you ever wanted a repeating watch, but you don't have real estate on your wrist type of money, a 5-minute repeater is a great way to do it. That, or get a minute repeating pocket watch, because those are still relatively cheap. I would also say that if we're going to talk about the Aerospace, we should probably talk about the original Omega X33.
Love the X33. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, the X33 came out in 1998, and it was described at the time as the Mars watch, because the idea was we were probably then on the cusp of going to Mars, and this would be the watch that would go there. It was certified for flight by NASA, and it was a Speedmaster Professional X33. It was not just a Speedmaster. So the Pro, meaning this thing was designed to fly, and it had impressive capabilities. A lot of the features and functions you have on the Aerospace, the alarm, 80 decibels, you could easily hear it over the din of a cockpit. You had chronograph, you had a second time zone, you had a countdown timer, you had a time of day alarm, all of it in a lovely 42mm titanium package, and it was a huge bomb. I don't mean to say it was a bad watch, it was not what the Moonwatch purist was looking for. And while it did yeoman duty for NASA, most people looking to buy a Speedmaster wanted the one that they wore on the moon, not the one that would be worn on Mars. And that's a real regret, because the watch itself was superb, easy to wear, relatively rare, and at the end of the day, they stopped making it for civilian consumption in 2006, though they continued to offer it through the military purchase program for a number of years after that. And I remember that because I was offered one by Omega through military purchase for like $700 on the Kevlar strap in 2009. And it was only a few hundred more on the full titanium bracelet. And they were delivering these things box and papers, including the original spacesuit white box that came with it. So it wasn't like you were getting short shrift on accessories. The one thing was you had to sign a little letter promising that you wouldn't sell it before 3 years had elapsed. And, fine. I mean, that's fine. Why would you buy it to sell it? It seemed like the coolest thing ever. But I thought I had time. I thought, oh, well, you know what I'll do? I'll wait on this. It's going to be there when I want it. And lo and behold, I waited too long. The military purchase program ended, I believe, just before I left. And you could still get the Speedmaster Professional Moonwatch, but you could not get the X33. There are a couple of different versions of the X33 out there. You can usually tell by whether the crown looks like a honey baster, because this crown was not designed to be used for winding. It was designed to be basically pulled in and out and pressed like a button. And you can also tell by whether the bezel is shiny. The Mark IIs did not feature shiny bezels, and they had the honey baster crown. But for a lot of folks who want the ultimate original X33, it's not between the first and second generation. It's second generation with the 1666D movement, which I believe was the only one of the bespoke 1666 calibers created for this watch that actually featured thermocompensation. And people ask me, well, why didn't it have that? It was going into space. And I said, yeah, but it wasn't certified for external use on a suit. So the assumption was that it would always be in a controlled environment with a human being. So it wouldn't be experiencing these extremes of temperature because it would be in the cabin or in the suit with the person, and the Moonwatch would be worn externally to the suit on some sort of a strap. So it didn't need thermocompensation.
That's interesting. I was wondering if the distinction was going to be that. It's also funny that you mentioned that it started out as, kind of the Mars watch. And that was news to me, actually. It's kind of come full circle as the latest edition of the X33 is the Mars timer.
Yeah, it really is. And X33 is back, and it's been back for a number of years. Really, it's been with us for over a decade now in the form of the Z33, which was too weird for most people, and then the X33 Skywalker, which is too complicated for most people. Honestly, I live in fear that a customer is going to ask me to set that for him. I did it once. It was like a 2-hour endeavor. I had to read the whole manual. It is not user-friendly, and if you are the kind of person who's interested in one of these, expect it to be a longer journey than most. I think there's the research and the fun of buying the watch, and then there's the long march of actually learning to use it. And if you don't use all the features on a regular basis, you will forget how to use them.
It's not at all intuitive, but it does function. Once you do know how to use it, and to your point, Tim, if you do use it regularly, you won't forget. But as soon as you go a week without using some of the functions, yeah, you'll forget how long you have to scroll.
Yeah, like if you haven't recently retroactively set your mission time, you might want to look that up. But a cool watch. I will say this, the original X33 is much more user-friendly, and you can sort of wing it and figure out how to use it. You cannot do that with the Skywalker. So although either of these watches can be bought for under $10,000, I would recommend going for the original for all sorts of reasons. And hey, maybe I was wrong about the Ultimate X33. I've seen a number of people who have NASA-issued prototypes of the watch from its early development between 94 and 98. Maybe that's the Ultimate X33.
That is the Ultimate. That's incredible.
Okay, so now a lot of folks think that the best thing about used watches is that you can get a lot of complication for less money, and actually they're completely right. They're absolutely on the mark, and I think that the Zenith Captain Windsor annual calendar is the best way to do this. So this came out in 2010, or at least it was shown in 2010, and it was a Ludwig Oxlin designed annual calendar, the one he originally designed for the MIH watch back in 2005, and it was a combination of that calendar with a Zenith El Primero chronograph, and the result is exactly as spectacular as it sounds. So 42 millimeters in steel. There's a couple of different versions of this. You can get gold. I don't recommend it. I don't see unless you're the guy who just has to have gold, I don't see the value equation there. Get it in steel. I think the best versions are the original black and blue dial, which is a nice two-tone color. And then later on in 2013, there was a boutique edition with a smoked precious metal palladium dial, and that was a steel case. Get one of those, but either way, you're getting a 42 millimeter El Primero, which is enough by itself to make a watch cool. but it's also Ludwig Oxland's annual calendar with a day, a date, and a month. Entirely wheel-based, it adds only 9 parts to the movement. It is a masterpiece from one of the great modern masters.
I like that boutique dial a lot. I've never seen that. It's kind of almost a fumet to a certain degree. It's very cool.
It is a fumet, but it's an unusual one because normally these smoked dials, they're light at the center and dark at the edge, and the gradient is radial. Whereas on this, it's a band. It's almost like there's a narrow band that passes through the center of the dial, and then the top of the dial and the bottom of the dial darken.
Yeah, that's a nice touch because it kind of frames the calendar complication. It kind of frames the sub-registers. It honestly makes it a little bit more legible in an interesting way.
Now, let me see if I can find what I got in mind. But yeah, I had an idea. If you want to get a tourbillon, a real Swiss-made tourbillon, the Orage tourbillons are now popping up for under $10,000 pre-owned. And this is a legit Swiss-made tourbillon watch. And it is a flying tourbillon, and it is a wearable size. The Lensman would be my choice. Titanium case, a watch that comes from a fun, smaller brand, 41 millimeters. You have a 100-hour power reserve, and this is a watch that you can wear just about anywhere. It's an everyday tourbillon. It's designed to be durable, water resistant. It's designed to be sized for a broad range of wrists, luminescent, attractive. There's a lot of action on the dial side with the flying tourbillon architecture. And 100 hours with a tourbillon is no mean feat. That's hard to do. It's even harder to do in a watch that's not gigantic, that doesn't have 2 or 3 mainspring barrels. So highly recommended on that front. Just go out and look for Orage tourbillons. You can't always be picky about which version is on the market because they'll make that many watches, and then they've had quite a few variants since they launched this. But a great way to get into a Swiss-made tourbillon that has above average tourbillon capability for not a lot of money.
That's a really good looking piece, actually. I'm pleasantly surprised by that, and that's not something that I was familiar with.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it is that it's a watch that is made by a small company, and I believe it's a husband and wife team behind that. And that's always a fun that's always a fun recipe for an independent brand, like with the Hobrings. It's always cool when it's a family affair. And this is a good watch that offers you something that normally costs at least tens of thousands of dollars. Now, you can go out and get Chinese tourbillon watches that cost a few hundred, but I think there is sort of like a threshold of quality that you abandon when you seek a tourbillon beyond a certain price point, and I mean that on the low side. Also, there are still some examples of the reference 50-15 50 fathoms out there for under $10,000. So guys, Blancpain, it's true, they're a little bit in danger of becoming a one model line watch, sort of in the same vein as Audemars Piguet. But what I can also say is that the 50-15 is one of the great modern classics. This is a watch launched in 2007 that cuts to the heart and soul of what Blancpain is. They are the creator of the 50 Fathoms, and whether you believe that the watch originally came out in 1953 or you believe the periscope, sort of revisionist history that was more like the mid-50s, there's no disputing that it was one of the original dive watches from the heyday of the amateur diving boom. And this watch came out to go head-to-head with the AP Royal Oak Offshore. And in many ways, it's a better watch. It is better finished. It has a more impressive movement. It is large at 45 millimeters because back in 2007, that was the thing. But it does not wear large. Lug-to-lug, 50.9 millimeters. If I can pull it off, guys, so can you. Get it on the strap. The sailcloth is sort of a signature for this model. 300 meters water resistant, 120 click bezel, and don't forget that sapphire capped bezel looks like $1 million. You can pick these up for $9,000 box and papers. You've got a watch that looks its price. Screw fixed lugs, not spring bars. You've got a movement with 3 mainspring barrels, 5 days of power reserve, anti-magnetic, shock resistant, hand finished. It's true a lot of the steel models have solid case backs, but the titanium models add display case backs. So search one of those. It may take a long time to find one of the titanium models for $10,000, but the steel models are out there, and inside they're all the same. You know the quality's there even if you can't see it.
Something like that. Yes, it's on the larger side, but again, you or I can wear it. And it's not large for large's sake. It's large because there are three mainspring barrels. There is a 5-day power reserve. It backs up its size with its movement in a nice way, I find.
Yeah, a tool watch that's big and visible is not as offensive as a dress watch that's oversized. So, the 2000s brought us lots of 45 and 46 millimeter Cartier dress watches, and that was too much. But a 45 millimeter watch that's all case with minimal lug, that's big, visible, and dive oriented, that's less offensive.
I have another mid to early 2000s watch, actually, that is in that range.
Oh, go for it.
This is the the IWC GST Rattrapante Chrono. This is a really cool piece. Rattrapante is something that I find to be remarkably interesting. It's my favorite chrono complication. If you were to add a complication on top of chrono, which arguably is probably my favorite complication. And this is a premier brand, and it's sharp looking.
It is a really good looking watch, and I think a lot of people regret after the fact that this watch kind of represented the end of the line of the old IWC. The GST originally came out in 1998, and the idea was that GST meant gold, steel, and titanium. And it was an integrated bracelet sports watch with 120 meter baseline water resistance. It created a platform for so many memorable models. There was the GST Alarm with the Jaeger-LeCoultre Memovox caliber. There was the GST Split with Richard Hoppering's great 7750-based split-second system. There was a perpetual calendar chronograph with the Kurt Klaus perpetual calendar system. And there was the legendary GST Deep 1 diving depth gauge in 1999. And all of these are all-timers, and they had bracelets that were fully sizable. Every single link was removable. They were beautifully made. They were finished in a style that was distinctly sober German Swiss, and they were generally nicely sized, nicely shaped, and modest in a way that quickly disappeared in the 2000s.
I just love, speaking of the depth gauge, I just love the little tester that you could attach to that. That's such a fun little extra that comes with the full set.
Yeah, if you're out there searching for a Deep 1, get the full set. The equipment that comes with that watch is among the most impressive you will find at any price, because it's all safety gear designed to test the mechanism before you dive with the watch. But that's why the GST is so well regarded. It really, 90s IWC could be a fantastic theme. And it's worth remembering back then the Portugueser had only just been revived in 1993. We saw the arrival of the Grand Complication in 1990. The first Portuguese minute repeater, I believe, was in 1994, 1995. We had the GSTs. We even had a couple of IWC watches with JLC 889 movements in them. I believe the Pilot Watch Mark 12 was JLC powered in the 90s. That was a beautiful watch. And I think there was a Saab co-branded version if you want something really quirky. Actually, let me see if that's around. Let me see if that's... I don't know.
My first car was a Saab 900S, 1993 convertible.
Was it problematic?
I put 3 transmissions and 2 motors in that car.
How did I guess?
In the 2.5 years that I owned it. Luckily, I was able to do all the work, but I spent a lot of times in junkyards while I owned that car.
Yeah, it's funny. I know a guy who does car YouTube, Kyle Lindsay, known as Saab Kyle04 on YouTube, and he used that name, Saab Kyle, because his first car was a Saab, and I asked him, was it a maintenance disaster? He said, absolutely. Don't buy an old European car, guys. If you got to buy something that's older than you or close, just go with some American car. I'm not saying it won't break down; it'll just cost less to fix.
The beauty with Saab is if it stops driving, the flywheel's on the front, so you can put a propeller on it and you can fly it somewhere.
So now you can actually go out and get a Tourbillon, BA 111OD, a strange name for a company, but they're working with tourbillon specialist Olivier Maury on a new series of tourbillon watches, and you go out and check out the Chapter 4.5 TVD, $7,200. You've got a 40mm case made of grade 5 tie. You've got a fair amount of lume. You have a tourbillon architecture with 105 hours of power reserve, and it's made in La Chaux de Fonds, which is to say that this is from the watchmaking heartland of Switzerland. Everything about this watch is everyday usable. And it's only 11 millimeters thick. It's 2,000 Gauss anti-magnetic. It's 5,000 G shock resistant. And this is basically, we were talking about beater watches. This is a beater tourbillon. It's just a cool watch.
It is. It's good looking.
Skeleton dial, a combination of tantalum gray, blue accents, really handsome looking watch. There is nothing I don't like about this, so go out and check that out. Weird name for a company, but check out the Chapter 4.5 TVD. They actually have a wait list of 6 to 8 months, so they found a receptive audience for their innovation in price and tech. So highly recommended. Weird name for a company, again, but then again, it gives you more to explain when you show it to someone. If you have, say, an Omega Speedmaster, there's not much to explain. Whereas when you've got something no one's ever seen, you get to tell the tale and be the first point of contact. It's almost like you're an ambassador for the brand, which can be a lot more fun than owning something everyone knows about.
I'll say too, 6 to 8 months is a fun waiting time. It gives you enough time to build excitement and positive anxiety around your purchase, and then you see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not a 5-year wait list. It's not a 2-year wait list. It's a reasonable wait list for something that's artisanally crafted.
And it's nice to be able to mark the calendar for this year, whereas Charles Frodsham now, last I heard, they have an 8-year waiting list.
Rexep, same deal.
Yeah, it's like a Richard Sachs bicycle. You'll take it, they'll wheel you off to your funeral on it. It's like the end of the world to wait that long for a watch, and that's why you see Frodsham watches now auctioning for a ton of money. I don't know what the wait is for a Grunewald watch because there's 2 different wait lists. There's the wait for them to reopen their wait list. Then there's the guy who's actually sitting on the conveyor belt and got an allocation. I don't know how long it takes from being notified you're part of the elect to actually getting, say, a Grunograph. Although I do know a gentleman who took delivery of one. It is beautiful. It's better than I expected.
The tantalum version too, right? Mm-hmm. Yep.
Definitely better than I expected on that front. Also worth mentioning, guys, let me see. There is the Diver 300 meter from the 90s. This was my first luxury watch. The 2531.80.00. It's one of the only Omega references I can remember. And yeah, it was James Bond's watch in the 90s. But if you think about it, this watch came out before Bond, or at least before Brosnan was Bond in 1993. And since the first diving Seamaster came out in 1957 with the Seamaster 300, almost like clockwork, every 8 to 10 years, the Seamaster would be completely redesigned with no reference to previous models and nothing retained stylistically. And it was kind of a soulless cycle of just searching for something that would stick. In 1993, when that Diver 300 meter arrived, I don't think any of us realized that, at this point, 31 years later, that design, with only minor modifications and updates, would still be in the catalog. That's never how the Seamaster collection was managed. That's never how Omega did business. At Omega, it was always scrap the old thing and promote the new one. With the Diver 300 meter, they finally found a design that could form a second pillar of their catalog alongside the Moonwatch and begin to echo the kind of evergreen continuity that they had with the Speedmaster Professional.
It's interesting you make that point because a very similar thing happened with Planet Ocean, which is now settled into a really nice span as well. They had a few movement changes in the early days of coaxial, the 2500 A through D, and not every movement change got a new reference number, but there were quite a few Planet Ocean reference numbers from its inception to where it is now.
Okay, now this is one for the big boys. If you remember the earliest days of the Omega Seamaster Aquaterra, you will recall that there were a couple of 49 millimeter versions. You can get them in white gold with enamel dial, in rose gold with enamel dial, or in stainless steel with the teak deck concept. Now, why would you want this? Well, a couple of reasons. Aside from being completely unique, this may be the largest chronometer-certified wristwatch movement ever made by Omega, and it's basically Omega's version of a 6497 with unique bridges, extended power reserve, 5-position adjustment, and a chronometer certification. This is a 150-meter watch, and the movement is absolutely to die for. It is a chronometer-certified pocket watch movement in a water-resistant, fully loomed manual wind watch. Caliber 2211, guys. If you can think of a larger chronometer-certified Omega wristwatch movement, let me know. But if you've got the wrist for one of these, and you can check 1916 Reviews, my other channel, and see one, this is a very unique piece. If you've got more money, I want to say right around 2010, 2011, we got the rose gold and the white gold enamel dial versions, which were a little bit more ornate with Breguet numerals. But that's an even more unique proposition because those were limited editions.
It's funny that that watch is so large and yet the movement fits the case back so well. Like that's fun to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where you've got a movement designed in the 50s, and it was originally designed for pocket watches and desk clocks. It's 36.5 millimeters in diameter, and no one was thinking about oversized watches in 1956, 1959 when this first movement arrived. It was something that was almost looked at as a dead end even then, because pocket watches were a dying enterprise in the late 50s. I don't think anyone imagined that the Unitas 6497 and 6498 would go on to have this enormous second wind and second life, powering giant wristwatches in the 21st century. Between Panerai and, I mean, mostly Panerai and some of these giant Omegas, it became a bit of a star in an era that was just starving for movements properly sized for the cases that were suddenly voguish. What else do you have for me? We're just about approaching the end of the line. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about auctions. Was there anything that stood out for you?
You know, yes, actually, the strength of the auctions stood out to me because some things are holding at levels that I didn't expect, and I'm very happy to see it hold at the levels. But you know, with auctions, the special stuff tends to rise to the top unless it's so special not enough people understand it, and some people can find a deal. But there's some run of the mill, some pieces that are very much I won't call dime a dozen, but very, very common pieces that trade for and hammer for above what we would call market. It's just interesting to see that in a market like this, which I guess is just means that the market is stronger than anticipated. It's solidifying a little bit more.
I think the place to go if you want like bargains or you want stuff that's off the beaten path, go with smaller auction houses like Watches of Knightsbridge or Dr. Krot if you're in Germany, or in Eichen if you're in Switzerland. All of these are sub-RM, sub-Phillips, sub-Sotheby's, sub-Christie's, and sometimes crazy stuff shows up. I remember one in Eichen auction back in 2022, and the same auction had, among other things, vintage Daniel Roth watches from the era when he was actually making the watches. The only example I've ever seen of a Gerard Perregaux vintage 1945 jackpot tourbillon and a fully skeletonized limited edition IWC Portuguese minute repeater. But to me, a lot of that weird stuff's more interesting, which is why I say find small auction houses and then hold them as close to the vest as you can. Particularly stuff that's lot unsold, shoot for that, because some of the best stuff is. I remember a few years back, there was an auction and someone couldn't be persuaded to bid the low estimate, which was like 25 grand for a platinum automatic Blancpain minute repeater from the 90s.
That's painful to hear.
Painful to hear, unless you're there and you're ready for it. I mean, that's the thing. You got to be looking for the weird stuff, because I'll be honest, if you want that headlining stuff, it's always available. There's always something like that out there if you're willing to pay the price. Not saying it isn't worth the money. I'm just saying it seems like things like this are always available. Whereas if you do want that Blancpain, it might be hard to find. If you do want a Schaefer case, minute repeating Audemars Piguet jump hour from the 90s, you might have to do some searching. But all these things that tend to be stars at the bottom of the auction catalog are what really excite me. A great example, something I saw today, Roger Dubuis, and this is a Roger Dubuis homage double flying tourbillon. So this is the kind of watch that a lot of folks just kind of don't think about. It was a watch launched in 2014 and 45 millimeters in rose gold. It was a manual wind twin flying tourbillon. This is a watch that back in its day would have cost well over $200,000. And it's the first one I've seen, and I've been doing this since 2014, the first one I've ever seen in person. Now, what would this cost if Grubel Forsey made it? Well, probably a retail for around $450,000, but this thing's selling pre-owned for under 99 grand. And oh, by the way, I actually went and I double checked, $330,000 new. Sale, figure 95 to 99,000. Now, this is a watch that's for sale at retail, but at auction, you can find things like this for even less. You don't necessarily need to beat a high bidder. You just have to beat the lowest acceptable reserve. That's the key thing. You just have to beat the reserve. Was there anything in particular that you saw at auction that interested you?
You know what? There were a few pieces that stood out at the time. Nothing that is outrageously like low hanging to me at the moment.
Okay. I mean, I'll do a quick rundown of some of these things. A titanium Oct Perpetual on a strap, $280,000. Titanium Anniversary Sontograph sold for $400,000. And a Black Label Resonance 2 for $391,000. Now, these are Journe results. I gotta be honest, there was a lot of that going on. A few elite brands selling for very high prices. So the question is whether or not the market we're in is strong in a way that's qualified by brand, which I think is probably the case. Patek, Journe, certain boutique independents, Philippe Dufour always brings a lot of money. We mentioned the waiting list for Fraudsham that can drive up prices at auction. But it's the kind of thing where, if you want something that no one else wants, sometimes an auction will bring it to market, not because it's worth so much money, but because no one knows what it is worth. It's so rare that the market will be created by the auction sale, which is why I say troll all of those little, maybe I should say trawl. Trolling is a different connotation in the internet sense. Trawl all of those little auction houses, put them on your calendar, get the catalogs emailed to you. You might find things you never imagined. Like one case, I saw a 1994 Reverso minute repeater in rose gold, 500-piece limited edition that sold for 23 grand at auction. And there was another auction, a small shop out of Manhattan, I think it was, back in 2015, and they had a platinum Reverso tourbillon up that wound up selling to me for 35 grand. And that became the only watch I ever owned on which I did not lose any money. So again, smaller auction houses, pay attention and forget whatever's on the cover of the auction catalog unless you absolutely have to own it. Turn to the back and find the weird things. Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining us this week. Again, podcasts at the1916company.com. If you have questions you would like us to answer, we can even turn them into show themes. Armand and I stand at the ready. Also check out our channels. We have 1916, which is our features channel for interviews, shows, commentary, and live streams, and 1916 reviews for daily, minutely reviews from 1 to 6 of all the watches that cross my desk. Time out, Tim out, Armand out. Thanks for logging on.